Hey guys, tonight we're not just going to drift off into dreamland. We're going on an epic journey. Imagine, for a moment, that you're standing on the edge of a vast, untamed wilderness. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant calls of unknown creatures. You're holding a rudimentary stone tool, and your entire existence revolves around the hunt, the forage, the raw struggle for survival. Communication for you is a series of guttural sounds, hand gestures, and urgent warnings. It's effective, sure, but limited. Now, picture that same wilderness, but slowly, painstakingly, humans begin to realize something profound. If they scatter seeds, food might just come to them. No more chasing mammoths across frozen plains, just tending to a patch of ground. This seemingly simple shift, this agricultural revolution, is where our story truly begins. And frankly, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in that era without a serious reevaluation of your survival skills. The mud huts and lack of Wi-Fi would be the least of your worries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far and wide our sleepy community stretches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin to settle. The constant gnawing anxiety of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where every rustle in the bushes could be dinner or be dinner, slowly recedes. You're planting seeds. You're waiting. And while you wait, something extraordinary starts to happen. You're not just hunting in small, transient groups anymore. You're staying put. Your family, your clan, is growing. You're building more permanent shelters, albeit still quite drafty. This settled life, this newfound relative stability, gives you something you never had before. Time. Time to observe, to reflect, to interact in more nuanced ways. The simple grunts and pointing gestures that suffice for warning about a tiger or celebrating a successful hunt suddenly feel inadequate. You need to talk about the weather, about the best time to plant barley, about who gets to guard the communal grain stores, and who keeps dipping into them when no one's looking. You know who you are. This is a mainstream historical fact. The move from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture around 10,000 BCE, primarily in the Fertile Crescent, marking the dawn of civilization. As you spend more time in one place, your group grows larger. You're no longer just 20 or 30 individuals. You're hundreds, perhaps even 1,000. Imagine trying to coordinate a harvest or a new irrigation ditch with only rudimentary signals. It's like trying to run a Fortune 500 company using only smoke signals and interpretive dance. It just won't cut it. Your language, once a fluid, immediate response to your environment, starts to solidify, to grow roots much like the crops you now tend. New words emerge. Words for planting, for harvesting, for storage, for surplus, for sharing, or, let's be honest, for squabbling over who gets the biggest share. The quirky tidbit here is how archaeological evidence suggests that with agriculture, human teeth actually started showing more signs of wear and tear from grinding grains, implying a dietary shift that would have absolutely influenced the sounds and words used to describe food preparation. Your jaw muscles were getting a workout, not just from chewing, but from all the new chit-chat. You're starting to differentiate between sounds, What was once a general grunt for danger now becomes specific. One sound for wolf, another for bear, yet another for your grumpy neighbor just stole your chickens again. These distinctions are vital for survival, for cooperation, and for preventing accidental or intentional misunderstandings. You're also starting to tell stories, not just about the last hunt, but about the seasons, about your ancestors, about the strange patterns of the stars. These narratives require a more complex sentence structure, a way to convey past, present, and future cause and effect. Historians still argue whether complex language enabled agriculture or if agriculture necessitated more complex language. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg situation, isn't it? But what's clear is that the two were inextricably linked, each feeding the development of the other. The more you settled, the more you talked. The more you talked, the more complex your society became, demanding even more sophisticated ways to communicate. It's a feedback loop, a linguistic spiral heading upwards, one careful seed at a time. And as those seeds grew, so too did the foundations of human communication, layer by intricate layer. As your little agricultural settlement thrived, you started seeing some serious changes. It wasn't just about planting seeds anymore. It was about managing larger harvests, dealing with more people, and, let's be honest, figuring out who was going to take out the communal trash. That sense of collective purpose, born from the shared labor of farming, began to solidify into something more organized. You'd gone from a loose band of survivalists to a budding community, and with that came the need for rules, for leadership, for a more sophisticated way of living together. Imagine trying to decide on the fair distribution of water from the new irrigation canal with only grunts and hand gestures. Someone would inevitably get splashed, and it wouldn't be pretty. This burgeoning complexity pushed the boundaries of your developing language. You needed words for chief, for council, for fair share, and perhaps most importantly, for "that's mine, hands off." This transition from small, scattered villages to larger, more concentrated settlements is a monumental mainstream historical fact, often referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. You weren't just building bigger huts. You were building something approaching actual neighborhoods. And with neighborhoods come neighbors, and with neighbors come, well, disagreements. Suddenly, your vocabulary needed to expand to include terms for negotiation, for dispute resolution, and for the increasingly specialized tasks that were emerging. Someone became good at pottery, another at weaving, another at building. These specialized skills demanded specific terminology. The potter needed words for different types of clay, for firing temperatures, for the various shapes of pots. The weaver needed terms for different fibers, for patterns, for the warp and weft. It was like suddenly everyone had their own little jargon, and you had to learn it all just to get by. This specialization also meant that not everyone was doing the same thing all the time. Some people were farming, some were crafting, some were defending the settlement. This societal differentiation created a demand for clearer, more efficient communication. You couldn't just shout across the field. You needed a system. This move from self-sufficiency within a family unit to a system of interdependent specialists is a quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked. It's not just that people lived closer. It's that they relied on each other in new ways, and that reliance was built on the increasingly sturdy bridge of shared language. Think of it like this. Your ancestor, the hunter, just needed to yell, "lion." Now, you need to explain to the potter, that you need 3 large unglazed pots for grain storage by the next full moon, please. And don't forget the lids. The stakes were higher, and the instructions needed to be precise. As these villages grew, some started to outgrow others. Perhaps they had better access to water, or more fertile land, or a particularly charismatic leader. These fortunate settlements swelled, pushing past the bounds of simple villages and morphing into what we recognize as the first cities. Think of them not as sprawling metropolises of glass and steel, but as densely populated clusters of mud brick homes, shared public spaces, and perhaps even early defensive walls. Within these nascent urban centers, the need for advanced linguistic structures became even more acute. You had larger populations to govern, complex irrigation systems to maintain, and burgeoning trade networks to manage. Imagine the sheer volume of information that needed to be conveyed. Orders from the chief, warnings about floods, records of traded goods. This is where the spoken word, no matter how sophisticated, began to hit its limits. You could tell someone something, but how would you ensure it was remembered accurately, days, weeks, or even years later? How would you send a message to a neighboring settlement without someone physically carrying it and potentially forgetting half the details? Historians still argue whether the pressure of managing large, complex urban populations directly led to the invention of writing, or if certain societies were simply primed for it. Was it an organic evolution or a desperate necessity? Regardless, the seeds were being sown for a revolutionary leap in communication. You were standing on the cusp of something truly monumental, where the fleeting breath of spoken language would soon find a permanent home on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls. The sheer administrative load of running a city, even a small one, was pushing human ingenuity towards a new frontier. You find yourself standing not just in a village, but in a burgeoning urban center, a cluster of mud brick buildings rising from the flat, fertile plains. The air hums with a new kind of activity. Not just the gentle rhythm of farming, but the organized chaos of specialized labor, the chatter of trade, the murmuring of a nascent bureaucracy. This isn't just any plain. You're in the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia to the Levant. This vast sweep of land, watered by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a cradle of innovation, a veritable laboratory for human societal development. It's a mainstream historical fact that this region saw the earliest development of agriculture, permanent settlements, and, crucially for our story, the first forms of writing. You feel the sun on your skin, perhaps a bit of dust in the air, and you know deep down that you are witnessing the birth of something truly transformative. Imagine the daily grind here. You're no longer just feeding your family. You're part of a larger system. Grain needs to be stored, distributed, and accounted for. Labor needs to be assigned. Taxes, yes, even then, need to be collected. Think of the sheer volume of information. How many bushels of barley did this family contribute? How many workers were assigned to the new irrigation ditch yesterday? Who owes what to whom? Trying to keep all of this straight in your head, or even through elaborate oral traditions, would be an administrative nightmare. It would be like trying to run Amazon using only a whiteboard and a very loud megaphone. You'd lose track of orders, deliveries, and probably your sanity pretty quickly. This burgeoning administrative need, the sheer mental bandwidth required to manage an increasingly complex society, was the direct pressure cooker that forged the need for a new way to record information. One quirky tidbit about this era: is that the earliest forms of record-keeping weren't about grand historical narratives or epic poems. They were utterly mundane. We're talking about receipts, accounting ledgers, inventories of sheep and sacks of grain. It's not glamorous, but it was absolutely essential. Imagine being the person tasked with remembering how many jars of olive oil were delivered to the temple last Tuesday. Your brain would feel like a poorly organized filing cabinet after about an hour. These early city-states, like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash in ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, were bustling hubs, and their complexity demanded a system that transcended the limits of human memory. They needed a way to make agreements binding, to track transactions reliably, and to pass information accurately from one person to another, even when those people were separated by space or time. You start to see people making marks on clay tablets. At first, they're simple pictures, pictograms. A crude drawing of a head might mean head or person. A drawing of a bowl might mean bowl or food. It's intuitive, yes, but also limited. How do you draw hunger or justice? Or that sheep looks suspiciously like my neighbor's sheep? This limitation, this inability to convey abstract concepts or grammatical nuances, pushed these early innovators to seek something more flexible, more powerful. Historians still argue whether the desire for more complex communication or the demands of economic administration was the primary driver for the development of writing. Was it the poets or the accountants who truly sparked the revolution? Perhaps it was a beautiful symbiosis, but the evidence heavily favors the diligent bean counters. These early Mesopotamian societies weren't just inventing a way to write. They were laying the groundwork for how language itself would be codified and managed for millennia to come. They were, in essence, creating the first ever data storage system. It wasn't digital, certainly not as sleek as your cloud storage, but those clay tablets, once dried in the sun or baked in a kiln, were remarkably durable. They could outlast empires, silently holding the mundane details of ancient life for thousands of years. You watch as a scribe, with a reed stylus in hand, presses wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. It's slow, laborious work, but each mark is a tiny victory against the fleeting nature of spoken words, a monumental step towards turning the sounds of language into something tangible, something permanent. This was the genesis of a system that would fundamentally alter the relationship between humans, information, and, most profoundly, language itself. You're looking over the shoulder of a scribe, perhaps in the bustling city of Uruk, where life is a ceaseless symphony of commerce and administration. He's not drawing pretty pictures. He's pressing a reed stylus into a soft, damp slab of clay. The marks he's making aren't immediately obvious as a language to your modern eyes, but they are the very genesis of one of humanity's most profound inventions, cuneiform. This is a mainstream historical fact, that the Sumerians in Mesopotamia developed the first known writing system, emerging around 3000 BCE. It began, as you might recall from our last quiet chat, with simple pictograms. But the demands of a complex society quickly pushed it beyond mere drawings. Imagine being an ancient accountant. Yes, they existed, and they probably had the same weary look in their eyes as modern ones. You need to record 30 sheep, 15 jars of oil, and 5 bags of grain. Drawing a sheep, a jar, and a bag repeatedly would be incredibly tedious and time-consuming. It's like trying to fill out your tax forms using only emojis. Fun for a minute, then utterly frustrating. This is where the practical origins of cuneiform shine. Instead of drawing a detailed sheep, scribes started to simplify. The image of a sheep became more abstract, more stylized, just a few lines to suggest the animal. Then, they realized they could combine symbols. A symbol for sheep plus a symbol for 30 was far more efficient than drawing 30 sheep. The peculiar aspect of cuneiform, and a quirky tidbit to ponder, is how the shape of the stylus and the medium, clay, influenced the script. You can't really draw smooth curves easily on wet clay with a blunt reed. What you can do, however, is press the end of the stylus into the clay, creating distinctive wedge-shaped marks. The word cuneiform itself comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. So, what started as a practical workaround for the limitations of the writing tools ended up defining the entire script. It's almost like if modern keyboards only allowed you to type in capital letters because it was easier to engrave them. A funny thought, perhaps, but a testament to how practical constraints can shape artistic and intellectual endeavors. You watch as the scribe works, his movements precise and practiced. He's not just making marks, he's capturing transactions, decrees, and perhaps even early literary works. Think about the implications. Before this, a verbal agreement was only as good as the memories and honesty of the people involved. Now, you have a physical record. If someone reneges on a deal, you can point to the tablet. See? Right here, you promised 2 sacks of dates for that ox. This ability to create a lasting, undeniable record fundamentally changed how business, law, and even governance operated. It brought a new level of accountability and order to society. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the shift from pictograms to these more abstract wedge shapes was purely efficiency, or if there was an underlying cognitive shift happening, a move towards representing sounds rather than direct objects. Was it simply about speeding up the process, or was it a deeper realization that language could be broken down into repeatable, abstract components? The earliest cuneiform wasn't fully phonetic, but it was certainly moving in that direction. It was a mixed system, using symbols to represent objects, ideas, and eventually, sounds. It's like watching a caterpillar slowly, painstakingly transform into a butterfly, still clumsy, but clearly destined for flight. The journey of cuneiform was just beginning, and with each wedge-shaped impression, the ancient world was carving out a new path for human communication. You're still mesmerized by the scribe, watching the evolution unfold right before your eyes. The early pictograms, those rough drawings of oxen or ears of grain, are quickly giving way to something more abstract, something that transcends the literal image. This is a mainstream historical fact. The evolution of cuneiform from pictograms to phonetics was a gradual yet profound shift. Initially, a drawing of a star might represent a star. Simple enough. But what if that star also needed to represent heaven or God? And how do you draw love? The limitations of direct representation quickly become apparent, much like trying to explain the complexities of quantum physics using only finger painting. The Sumerians, ever practical, began to realize that some symbols could represent sounds, not just objects. This is where things get really clever. Imagine the symbol for water, A, in Sumerian. Instead of just meaning water, it could now represent the sound A, in other words. This revolutionary idea known as the rebus principle, allowed them to write words for which there were no easy pictographic representations. It's like if in English the drawing of a bee followed by the drawing of a leaf could represent the word belief. You see how the sounds combine, rather than the objects themselves. This was a massive leap, transforming writing from a visual aid for memory into a genuine representation of spoken language. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this transition is the sign for read. In Sumerian, the word for read was pronounced G. This same sound, G, was also the word for return or repayment. So the pictogram of a reed could eventually come to mean return in certain contexts, simply because of the shared sound. It's a linguistic pun, essentially, embedded in the very foundations of writing. This ability to use a sign for its sound value, regardless of its original meaning, was the key that unlocked the true power of writing. You're watching the very birth of what would become the alphabet, thousands of years before it fully blossomed. This development wasn't instantaneous. For a long time, cuneiform remained a mixed system, combining ideograms, symbols representing ideas or objects, syllabic signs, symbols representing syllables, like B, A, or K, and determinatives, signs that helped clarify the meaning of a word, like indicating that the preceding word was a god's name or a city. It was, by modern standards, incredibly complex, requiring years of arduous study to master. Imagine having to learn thousands of different symbols, each with multiple potential meanings depending on context, and some of which represented sounds, while others represented entire concepts. It's enough to make your brain feel like a tangled ball of yarn. Historians still argue whether the primary force driving this phonetic shift was purely efficiency in record keeping, or if there was a deeper desire among scribes to capture the nuances of speech more accurately. Was it about making accounting easier? Or was it about writing down epic poems and legal codes with greater fidelity? Perhaps it was a beautiful interplay of both, where the practical needs for clear communication in administration paved the way for the artistic and intellectual aspirations of a literate society. But what's clear is that as these wedge-shaped marks began to represent sounds, not just things, the very fabric of language was laid bare, allowing its ephemeral nature to be captured, analyzed, and transmitted in ways previously unimaginable. This was no longer just about tracking barley. It was about capturing the very essence of human thought and expression. As cuneiform evolved, becoming increasingly sophisticated, a new class of individuals rose to prominence: the scribes. You see them everywhere now, hunched over their clay tablets, their hands deftly pressing the reed stylus. They're not just record keepers. They are the gatekeepers of knowledge, the living embodiment of the new power that writing bestowed. This is a mainstream historical fact. In ancient Mesopotamia, literacy was a rare and highly valued skill, and scribes formed an elite class, crucial for the functioning of society. They were, in essence, the IT department, the accountants, and the librarians all rolled into one. And unlike your average IT support, they probably didn't ask if you'd tried turning your tablet off and on again. Learning cuneiform was no small feat. It wasn't like picking up a simple alphabet. You had to master hundreds, sometimes thousands of signs, many with multiple meanings and phonetic values. This required years of intensive schooling, often starting in childhood. Young boys, and occasionally girls, though it was rare, would spend their days in the adaba, the tablet house, or scribal school, practicing signs, copying texts, and memorizing vast lists of words and grammatical rules. It was a rigorous education, often enforced with a literal stick. A common quirky tidbit is the man with the stick, the school's disciplinarian, whose job it was to ensure students stayed focused. Imagine having a teacher whose main pedagogical tool was a piece of wood. Suddenly, your high school detention doesn't seem so bad, does it? This demanding training meant that scribes were a limited resource, and thus incredibly powerful. They were the ones who could read the omens, interpret the laws, manage the royal treasury, and communicate with distant lands. Their literacy gave them unparalleled access to information, which, as we all know, is power. If you wanted to send a message, record a transaction, or understand a decree, you needed a scribe. They were the bottleneck, and they knew it. This control over information flow cemented their position at the heart of the social and political structure. They weren't just transcribing, they were often advising, interpreting, and even shaping policy. Think about the implications for language itself. With scribes standardizing the written forms of words, dialects that might have otherwise diverged through purely oral transmission now had a common anchor. The written language, precisely because it was so difficult to learn and controlled by a select few, became a more conservative force than spoken language. Spoken language can shift and evolve quickly, picking up slang and regional variations like lint on a velvet jacket. But written language, especially in a system as complex as cuneiform, tends to be more resistant to change. This meant that the official, written version of a language could persist for centuries, even as spoken dialects drifted. Historians still argue whether the dominance of the scribal class was a necessary byproduct of a complex writing system, or if it was a deliberate strategy by rulers to maintain control over information. Was it an accidental elite, or a carefully cultivated one? Regardless, the fact remains. Literacy became a tool for administration, and even more significantly, a tool for control. It allowed rulers to issue commands that would be understood consistently across vast territories. It allowed legal precedents to be set and followed. It allowed history to be recorded, and often, conveniently, rewritten. For the first time, language wasn't just something that flowed from the mouth. It was something that could be etched into stone, codified, and wielded as an instrument of governance and power. And as you gaze upon the scribe's meticulous work, you realize that this quiet, diligent act is shaping not just the fate of a city, but the very trajectory of human civilization and the future of language itself. As your understanding of cuneiform deepens, you're whisked away, not by a magic carpet, but by the relentless march of time and the currents of trade, downstream and westward. You find yourself now gazing upon a different landscape, one dominated by the majestic, life-giving Nile River and the monumental structures that pierce the desert sky. You are in ancient Egypt, a land of pharaohs, gods, and a truly captivating writing system, hieroglyphs. This is a mainstream historical fact that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing emerged around 3200 BCE, roughly contemporary with early cuneiform, though developing independently. You can feel the dry desert air on your skin, hear the distant calls of waterfowl from the river, and perhaps even catch the faint, musky scent of papyrus. Unlike the practical, wedge-shaped impressions of Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs immediately strike you with their artistry. They are images, birds, snakes, human figures, baskets, eyes, a veritable menagerie of the visible world. Each one is meticulously carved or painted, often bursting with vibrant colors that, even thousands of years later, retain a ghostly echo of their original brilliance. You might even find yourself wondering if they were designed to be beautiful first and functional second. It's almost as if the Egyptians wanted their writing to be as eternal and aesthetically pleasing as their pyramids. A quirky tidbit about hieroglyphs is their incredible flexibility and direction. Unlike modern English, which strictly reads left to right, or even cuneiform, which eventually settled on left to right, hieroglyphs could be read from left to right, right to left, or even vertically, top to bottom. How do you know which way to read? You simply look at the figures of people or animals. They generally face the direction from which you should begin reading. So, if a bird faces left, you read from left to right. If it faces right, you read right to left. It's like a secret little compass embedded in the script, a playful challenge for anyone attempting to decipher their secrets. Imagine trying to read a modern book where every paragraph decided on its own reading direction based on which way the first letter was leaning. A delightful nightmare, surely. Despite their pictorial appearance, hieroglyphs, much like cuneiform, were not just pictures. They functioned in multiple ways. Some were pictograms, directly representing the object they depicted, e.g., a circle for sun. Others were ideograms, representing a concept associated with the object, e.g., the sun disk could mean day or time. Crucially, many hieroglyphs were also phonograms, representing sounds, either single consonants, like an alphabet, or combinations of consonants, syllables. And then there were determinatives, non-pronounced signs added to clarify the meaning of a word, especially useful for words that sounded the same but had different meanings, like read versus read in English. It was a complex, layered system, a beautiful linguistic onion. Historians still argue whether the aesthetic demands of Egyptian monumental art influenced the development of their writing system, or if the system's visual richness naturally lent itself to being incorporated into art and architecture. Was the art dictating the script, or was the script inspiring the art? What's undeniable is that hieroglyphs were deeply intertwined with religious and royal power. You see them adorning temple walls, inside tombs, and on statues, designed to communicate with the gods, to eternalize the deeds of pharaohs, and to guide the deceased into the afterlife. They were a sacred script, imbued with magical power, a visual language designed to last for eternity. This spiritual connection elevated hieroglyphs beyond mere record-keeping. They were a direct link between the earthly realm and the divine, spoken by the gods themselves and etched into the very fabric of existence. You've just witnessed the visual poetry of hieroglyphs, etched into stone for eternity. But not all writing in ancient Egypt was destined for monumental walls or sacred tombs. Imagine the sheer logistics of running an empire. Pharaohs needed to issue decrees. Officials needed to record taxes. Priests needed to keep track of temple inventories. And merchants needed to document trade agreements. Carving every single document into stone would be impossibly slow and expensive. This is where a revolutionary material and a corresponding evolution in the writing system enters the scene. You find yourself walking along the banks of the Nile, where the tall, slender stalks of papyrus grow in abundance. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Egyptians were pioneers in using papyrus, a reed-like plant, to create a lightweight, portable writing surface that radically transformed administrative practices. The process of making papyrus was ingenious. The fibrous inner pith of the papyrus plant was cut into thin strips, laid side by side in 2 layers, one horizontal, one vertical, pressed, and then dried. The plant's natural sap acted as a glue, binding the strips together to form a remarkably durable sheet. These sheets could then be joined to create long scrolls, perfect for extended texts. Suddenly, language wasn't just confined to the weighty permanence of stone. It could be rolled up, carried, and sent across vast distances. It was the ancient world's equivalent of moving from chiseling tablets to printing documents on paper. Imagine the relief of the scribes. No more lugging around heavy clay slabs or squinting at rough chisel marks. With the advent of papyrus, the formal, intricate hieroglyphs, while still used for religious and monumental purposes, started to give way to more cursive, speedier forms of writing for everyday use. First came hieratic, a simplified, flowing version of hieroglyphs, often used for administrative documents, legal texts, and literary works. Then, even later, came demotic, an even more abbreviated and highly cursive script that became the common script for everyday transactions, letters, and popular literature. It's a quirky tidbit that these more cursive scripts were often written in horizontal lines from right to left, a reversal of the typical hieroglyphic direction, which could vary. It's almost as if, once they had a lighter, faster medium, they decided to shake things up and write in a whole new way, much like how text messaging abbreviations came about from the need for speed on tiny phone keypads. This shift to papyrus and cursive scripts had profound implications for the development of bureaucracy. With readily available and portable writing materials, it became possible to manage an empire of millions. Orders from the pharaoh could be disseminated quickly and accurately to distant provinces. Taxes could be meticulously recorded and accounted for. Legal judgments could be written down and referenced. Think of the sheer volume of paperwork, or papyrus work, involved in administering a complex society. Detailed census records, land ownership documents, lists of supplies for the army, medical texts, astronomical observations. This was the backbone of Egyptian administration, allowing for a level of centralized control and organization that would have been impossible without an efficient writing system and a lightweight medium to carry it. Historians still argue whether the existence of an accessible writing material like papyrus spurred the growth of bureaucracy, or if the demands of an expanding bureaucracy necessitated the development of such materials. Was the tool creating the need, or the need creating the tool? Regardless, the impact was undeniable. The scribe, once a monumental carver, became a swift penman, enabling the flow of information that lubricated the gears of the state. You can almost hear the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls being unrolled in dusty administrative offices, the quiet scratch of the reed pen, as the language of ancient Egypt, in its many forms, helped to build and maintain one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. The ability to record and transport information effectively was, truly, the engine of empire. You've seen hieroglyphs etched in stone and scrawled on papyrus, but for millennia their secrets remained locked away, a beautiful but impenetrable mystery. For almost 500 years after the last known hieroglyphic inscription was made, in 394 CE, no one could read them. It was as if an entire civilization had simply vanished from the linguistic map, leaving behind tantalizing clues that defied understanding. Scholars tried, certainly, But without a key, it was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. This linguistic blackout is a striking mainstream historical fact, leaving a massive gap in our understanding of ancient Egyptian history, religion, and daily life. You can almost feel the frustration of those early attempts, grasping at pictorial straws. Then, in 1799, something truly extraordinary happened. Something that would change the course of Egyptology forever. A French soldier, part of Napoleon Bonaparte's expeditionary force in Egypt, was demolishing an old wall near the town of Rosetta, modern-day Rashid, in the Nile Delta. He unearthed a large broken slab of black granodorite covered with 3 distinct types of writing. This unassuming stone, dubbed the Rosetta Stone, became the legendary key that unlocked the secrets of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's like finding the instruction manual for a time machine you didn't even know existed. A quirky tidbit about the Rosetta Stone is that it's not some grand historical epic. It's actually a mundane decree issued by a council of priests in 196 BCE, affirming the royal cult of King Ptolemy V Epiphanes. Imagine if the key to understanding all of modern English lay hidden in an old grocery store receipt. It's almost comically anticlimactic, yet its significance is immeasurable. The decree was written in 3 scripts: Egyptian hieroglyphs, the formal script; demotic, the common Egyptian script of the time, which you remember from our last chat; and ancient Greek. Ancient Greek was a known language to scholars, offering a crucial bridge to the unknown Egyptian scripts. The real hero of this story, arguably, is Jean-François Champollion, a brilliant French philologist. Working painstakingly, often in parallel with others like Thomas Young, Champollion focused on identifying proper names, particularly that of Ptolemy. He noticed that some hieroglyphic signs were enclosed in an oval loop, a cartouche, which he suspected indicated royal names. By comparing the known Greek name Ptolemy to the cartouche in the hieroglyphic text, he was able to deduce the phonetic values of several hieroglyphs. It was a monumental intellectual feat, a true code-breaking masterpiece. Imagine finally finding the decoder ring to the most complex puzzle ever invented. Historians still argue whether Champollion's linguistic genius was entirely independent, or if he built more directly on the foundational work of Thomas Young, an English polymath, than he publicly acknowledged. Was it a singular stroke of genius, or a collaborative effort with a dramatic finish? Regardless of the exact intellectual lineage, by 1822, Champollion famously declared, "Je tiens mon affaire," "I've got it," and was able to systematically decipher the hieroglyphic system. His breakthrough demonstrated that hieroglyphs were not merely symbolic pictures, as many had long believed, but a complex system combining logographic, word-based, syllabic, syllable-based, and alphabetic, sound-based elements. The impact of the Rosetta Stone cannot be overstated. It didn't just allow us to read ancient Egyptian, it opened a window into an entire civilization that had been silent for centuries. Suddenly, the voices of pharaohs, priests, and common people could be heard again through their own words. Texts that had been meaningless carvings became vibrant accounts of history, religion, science, and daily life. It was a resurrection of a lost language, a profound reminder of the power of translation, and a testament to human ingenuity in bridging the gaps of time and understanding. As you close your eyes, you can almost hear the whispered secrets of the past, finally set free by that remarkable slab of stone. You've traveled through the cradle of Mesopotamia and the grandeur of Egypt, witnessing the birth of writing as a tool for administration and power. Now, let's journey eastward, across vast desert landscapes and formidable mountain ranges, to another great river valley civilization that rose simultaneously, yet remains shrouded in a captivating linguistic mystery. You are now in the Indus Valley, a sprawling civilization that flourished from around 2500 to 1900 BCE, encompassing parts of modern-day Pakistan and India. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Indus Valley civilization was one of the three early cradles of civilization in the Old World, alongside Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, boasting advanced urban planning and sophisticated infrastructure. You sense the ancient dust settling on what were once bustling cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Silent now, their secrets held close. Unlike the readily deciphered cuneiform or the eventually cracked hieroglyphs, the writing system of the Indus Valley civilization, often referred to as the Indus Script, remains stubbornly unread. Imagine a thriving, advanced society building massive, organized cities with intricate drainage systems, trade networks stretching thousands of miles, and even standardized weights and measures. Yet, their written language, found on thousands of small seals, pottery fragments, and copper tablets, has defied all attempts at decipherment. It's like finding a brilliantly designed car that runs perfectly, but with an engine manual written in a language no one on Earth can understand. A quirky tidbit about the Indus script is the sheer variety of its symbols, with over 400 distinct signs identified. This number is too high for an alphabet, which typically has 20-40 signs, and too low for a purely pictographic system where every word or idea has its own unique drawing. This suggests it might be a logographic syllabic system, similar in complexity to Sumerian cuneiform or Mayan hieroglyphs. What's even more intriguing is that the vast majority of the inscriptions are incredibly short, often just a few signs long. Many appear on small stamp seals, perhaps indicating ownership or a specific commodity being traded. Imagine trying to decipher a language based almost entirely on ancient shipping labels and business cards. It's a linguistic puzzle of epic proportions, and frankly, it probably gives modern linguists a few sleepless nights. Despite numerous attempts, employing everything from statistical analysis to artificial intelligence, no one has definitively proven a connection to any known language family, nor have they found a bilingual text, our beloved Rosetta Stone equivalent, that could provide a key. This lack of a Rosetta Stone equivalent is one of the primary reasons for its continued inscrutability. You can feel the weight of that silence, the frustration of scholars who have dedicated their lives to understanding these enigmatic symbols. Historians and linguists still argue vehemently over the nature of the Indus script. Is it a true writing system representing spoken language, or is it a system of non-linguistic symbols, perhaps representing religious iconography, clan emblems, or economic tallies, akin to heraldic devices or ancient company logos? The debate rages on. Some propose it's an early form of Dravidian languages spoken in southern India. Others suggest it relates to Indo-Aryan languages. And a third camp argues it's not a language in the traditional sense at all. The mystery of the Indus script underscores how precarious our understanding of ancient languages can be when the critical tools for decipherment are missing. You can almost hear the whispered debates in scholarly halls, each theory meticulously constructed, yet none providing the definitive answer. The silence of the Indus Valley speaks volumes about the challenges of linguistic archaeology, reminding us that some ancient tongues may forever remain just beyond our grasp, a permanent whisper on the winds of time. You've witnessed the isolated birth of writing in the great river valleys. But civilizations don't exist in a vacuum. They trade. They migrate. They even, occasionally, engage in what we politely call cultural exchange, and sometimes less politely, invasion. As the Bronze Age dawned and flourished, roughly 3,300 BCE to 1,200 BCE, something truly revolutionary began to take shape. Vast networks of trade and interaction that stretched across continents. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Bronze Age was characterized by extensive long-distance trade routes, facilitating the exchange of not just goods like tin and copper, but also ideas, technologies, and, crucially for our narrative, linguistic influences. You can almost feel the gentle rocking of a small ship laden with goods, or the rhythmic plodding of a donkey caravan connecting distant lands. Imagine a merchant from Mesopotamia, perhaps haggling over a shipment of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, or trading grain for Cypriot copper. He's not just exchanging goods, he's exchanging words. Perhaps he picks up a few phrases of the local dialect, or introduces new terms for his wares. These interactions, repeated over generations, create a linguistic ripple effect. Think of it like a game of ancient telephone, but instead of whispering a secret, you're inadvertently sharing linguistic innovations. New words for materials, tools, and abstract concepts associated with trade, like value or debt, would begin to seep into different languages. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this is the spread of certain loanwords related to specific commodities. For instance, the word for tin, essential for making bronze, or copper itself, often shows similarities across distinct language families in the ancient Near East, suggesting their diffusion along trade routes. It's almost as if the objects themselves carried their names with them, whispering them into the ears of anyone who touched them. Or consider the chariot, a game-changing invention of the Bronze Age. The words for chariot, or its parts, often originating in Indo-European languages, can be traced across vast distances, carried by the very people who introduced the technology. You might not have survived a chariot race, but your words certainly did. These trade networks weren't just simple back-and-forth exchanges, they were intricate webs. The Sea Peoples, for instance, a mysterious confederation of maritime raiders and migrants, played a role in disrupting and perhaps also spreading linguistic elements across the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age collapse. While their exact origins and roots are debated, their impact on regional languages, perhaps leaving behind linguistic ghosts in various dialects, is a fascinating area of speculation. This global interconnectedness, however rudimentary by modern standards, meant that languages were no longer evolving in isolation. They were constantly bumping into each other, borrowing, adapting, and influencing each other. Historians still argue whether these trade routes primarily facilitated the borrowing of individual words, or if they also led to significant structural changes in languages through prolonged contact. Was it simply about picking up a few handy nouns? Or did languages actually start to sound and function more similarly because of constant interaction? The concept of a Sprachbund, a group of languages that have become grammatically or phonologically similar due to extensive historical contact, even if they aren't genetically related, is a testament to this profound impact. As you drift deeper into this historical reverie, you can almost hear the babble of ancient markets, a symphony of diverse tongues mingling and merging, forever altering the linguistic landscape of the world. The sounds of commerce were, in a very real sense, shaping the sounds of human speech. You've seen the monumental complexity of cuneiform and hieroglyphs, systems that required years of dedicated study to master. They were powerful, certainly, but they were also exclusive, controlled by an elite scribal class. Imagine trying to teach everyone in your village to read and write with a system that has hundreds or even thousands of distinct signs. It would be an educational nightmare. But as the Bronze Age trade networks expanded, fostering contact between diverse peoples, the seeds of a revolutionary simplification began to sprout. The emergence of early alphabets. This is a mainstream historical fact, that the conceptual leap from complex logographic and syllabic systems to more streamlined alphabetic scripts was one of the most significant developments in the history of writing. You feel a sense of lightness, a dawning realization that communication is about to get a whole lot easier for everyone. The journey towards the alphabet didn't happen overnight, nor did it happen in one single place. It was a gradual evolution, likely influenced by the practical needs of people who needed to write but didn't have the time or resources for extensive scribal training. Think of the Semitic-speaking peoples working in Egyptian mines in the Sinai Peninsula around 2500 BCE. They encountered hieroglyphs daily, but perhaps they only needed to write short, simple messages, names, basic commands, inventory lists. They started to borrow hieroglyphic signs, but instead of using them for their original meaning or even their full phonetic value, they used them to represent the first sound of the word the hieroglyph depicted. This is known as the acrophonic principle. A quirky tidbit to illustrate this is the origin of our letter Ah. In early Semitic scripts, the letter Ah looked like an ox's head. The Semitic word for ox was aleph. So the sign for the ox's head came to represent the Ah sound, because that was the first sound of the word aleph. Similarly, the sign for house, bet, came to represent the B sound. You can almost see the ancient miner, scratching out a simple message, unknowingly laying the groundwork for every text message, email, and novel ever written. It's like discovering that your phone's autocorrect function secretly created an entirely new language over centuries. These early Semitic scripts, often called Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite, were not full alphabets in the modern sense. They primarily represented consonants, with vowels often left unwritten, relying on context for understanding. This isn't as strange as it sounds. Many Semitic languages, even today, like Arabic and Hebrew, primarily write consonants. Imagine reading English where you just see CT, and you have to infer if it's cat, cut, or cot from the surrounding words. It required a bit more mental heavy lifting, but it was still a monumental simplification compared to cuneiform. Historians still argue whether the invention of these early alphabets was a conscious act of brilliant simplification by a single individual or a more organic, piecemeal evolution driven by practical necessity among less educated populations. Was it a stroke of genius, or the collective wisdom of thousands of unschooled but ingenious individuals? Regardless, the impact was profound. By reducing the number of signs needed to represent a language from hundreds or thousands to a mere few dozen, the barrier to literacy plummeted. Writing was no longer the exclusive domain of scribes and priests. It was becoming a tool accessible to merchants, soldiers, and eventually, even the common person. This fundamental simplification of writing was the intellectual equivalent of inventing the wheel. Suddenly, the path to widespread literacy was paved, ready for the world to roll along it. You've just seen how the first alphabets, those lean, efficient tools for recording sounds, began to emerge. But a brilliant invention sitting in a mine shaft in Sinai doesn't change the world on its own. It needs a carrier, a vehicle to spread its revolutionary simplicity. And in the ancient world, few were better carriers of ideas than the Phoenicians. This is a mainstream historical fact. These remarkable seafarers, merchants, and traders based along the coast of the Levant, modern-day Lebanon and Syria, were instrumental in disseminating the early alphabetic script across the Mediterranean world, starting around 1200 BCE. You can almost taste the salt spray, hear the creak of wooden ships, and imagine these intrepid sailors navigating by the stars, their holds full of exotic goods, and, unknowingly, the seeds of future languages. The Phoenicians weren't empire builders in the mold of the Egyptians or Mesopotamians. They were practical business people, establishing trading posts and colonies from Cyprus to Carthage in modern Tunisia, and even as far as the Iberian Peninsula. Their primary motivation was commerce, buying, selling, and transporting goods like timber, purple dye, their most famous export, made from murex snails, which was so rare and expensive it became associated with royalty, glass, and metalwork. Imagine running a multinational shipping company without a quick, easy way to keep track of inventories, invoices, and contracts in different ports. Their complex trade network desperately needed a universal, adaptable writing system. This is where the early Semitic alphabet, which was beautifully suited for their Semitic language, came into its own. It was simple, consisting of just 22 signs, all consonants. No complex pictograms or hundreds of syllabic signs to memorize. It was a no-nonsense, get-the-job-done kind of script, perfect for the fast-paced world of maritime trade. A quirky tidbit about the Phoenician alphabet is its complete lack of vowels. Imagine trying to read English words like BLD, gold, MLK, and figuring out if they mean bold, build, blood, gold, guild, glad, milk, or mulch. It relied heavily on context and the reader's existing knowledge of the spoken language. It sounds challenging to us, but for native speakers, it was perfectly functional, proving that sometimes less is indeed more, especially when you're trying to write quickly on a rocking ship. As Phoenician ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, they didn't just carry goods, they carried their script. Every time a Phoenician merchant made a deal in a foreign port, every time a new trading post was established, the alphabet came with them. Local populations, seeing the efficiency and practicality of this simple system, began to adopt and adapt it for their own languages. This wasn't a cultural conquest by force, but a linguistic one by utility. It was a classic case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it's simpler and works better, definitely copy it. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians consciously marketed their alphabet as a superior system, or if its spread was simply an organic consequence of their widespread commercial activities. Was it a deliberate export or an accidental gift? Regardless, the impact was profound. Their single consonant alphabet was a lean, mean writing machine. It proved that a writing system didn't need to be aesthetically complex or religiously imbued to be powerful. Its power lay in its sheer simplicity and adaptability. You can almost see the ancient scribes of other cultures scratching their heads over their own cumbersome systems, looking at the Phoenician script and thinking, wait a minute, that's so much easier. This was the moment the linguistic tide truly turned, setting the stage for the next great revolution in writing, one that would make it even more accessible to the masses. You've just witnessed the Phoenicians, those ancient shipping moguls, spreading their minimalist alphabet like wildfire across the Mediterranean. But a script with only consonants, however efficient for quick mercantile notes, still left something to be desired for languages with richer vowel sounds. Imagine trying to sing an opera using only the consonants. You'd lose a lot of the emotional depth, wouldn't you? This is where the Greeks enter the linguistic stage, and they didn't just adopt the Phoenician alphabet, they perfected it. This is a mainstream historical fact. Around the 8th century BCE, the ancient Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet, making a crucial innovation by adding consistent signs for vowels, fundamentally transforming the nature of writing. You can almost hear the soft lapping of waves against the shores of ancient Aegean islands. A new intellectual current beginning to flow. The genius of the Greek adaptation lay in a deceptively simple idea, taking some of the Phoenician consonantal signs for sounds that didn't exist in Greek and repurposing them to represent vowels. For example, the Phoenician letter aleph, which we remembered as the ox head, representing a glottal stop sound at the beginning of words, like the break in uh-oh, became the Greek alpha, representing the ah sound. The Phoenician, he became the Greek epsilon e, and so on. It was a brilliant hack, turning a system designed for a Semitic language into one perfectly suited for the Indo-European family of languages to which Greek belonged. A quirky tidbit that highlights the Greek ingenuity is how they derived the letter O. The Phoenician letter ayin, which represented a guttural sound pronounced deep in the throat, had no equivalent in Greek. So, the Greeks, perhaps noticing its circular shape, simply turned it into omicron, representing the short O sound. Later, they even invented a new sign for the long O sound, omega, literally meaning great O. It's like discovering that a spare car part can be re-engineered into something even more useful than its original purpose, a testament to their practicality and linguistic insight. Imagine the light bulb moment. Hey, we don't need this throat noise. Let's make it a vowel. This seemingly small innovation had monumental consequences. By explicitly representing vowels, the Greek alphabet became the first truly phonetic alphabet, meaning that nearly every sound in the spoken language had a corresponding written symbol. This made reading and writing significantly easier to learn and more accessible to a wider population. No longer did you have to guess at the vowels based on context or rely solely on native speaker intuition. You could, for the first time, accurately transcribe virtually any word from any language using a relatively small set of symbols. This wasn't just about efficiency. It was about clarity and precision. Historians still argue whether the Greek addition of vowels was a practical necessity driven by the phonetic structure of their language, or if it was a deliberate intellectual breakthrough that recognized the underlying phonemic structure of speech. Was it an accidental fit, or a conscious act of linguistic brilliance? Regardless, the impact was undeniable. The easily learned Greek alphabet fostered widespread literacy, which in turn contributed to the flourishing of Greek literature, philosophy, science, and democracy. For the first time, complex ideas could be recorded and disseminated widely, allowing for intellectual discourse and critical thought to transcend the limitations of oral tradition. You can imagine philosophers like Plato and Aristotle seeing their intricate arguments preserved not just in memory but in legible, repeatable written form. The legacy of the Greeks and their perfected alphabet would echo through the millennia, providing the direct foundation for nearly all subsequent Western alphabets, including the one you are reading right now. You've watched the Greek alphabet, with its brilliant addition of vowels, become the most efficient writing system the ancient world had yet seen. But even the best ideas need a powerful vehicle for widespread adoption. And when it came to conquering and spreading culture, no one did it quite like the Romans. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Roman Empire, through its vast military conquests and administrative reach, spread the Latin language and its derived alphabet, itself a direct descendant of the Greek, across much of Europe and North Africa, fundamentally shaping the linguistic landscape of the Western world. You can almost hear the rhythmic march of legions, the clatter of armor, and the confident pronouncements in Latin echoing across newly established provinces. The Romans were incredibly pragmatic. They adopted much from the Greeks, not least their alphabet. They took the Greek alphabet, which they received via the Etruscans in Italy, made a few modifications, dropped a few letters they didn't need, and added a couple of new ones. The result was the Latin alphabet, a slightly simplified, yet incredibly robust system. For instance, the Greek letter kappa, K, was largely dropped in favor of C for the K sound, and they introduced G by modifying K to represent a voiced velar stop. It was a no-nonsense refinement designed for efficiency in administration and communication across a vast and growing empire. A quirky tidbit is that the Roman alphabet initially had no lowercase letters or punctuation as we know it. Imagine reading entire texts in all caps, with no periods, commas, or even spaces between words, a style called scriptio continua. It would be like trying to decipher a very long, very loud telegram. I am going to mark buying bread and cheese back soon. It demanded that the reader actively sound out and parse the text, a skill that required considerable practice and understanding of the language's rhythm. This lack of spacing perhaps highlights how closely linked written language still was to spoken language, where pauses and intonation naturally delineate words. As Rome expanded, so did Latin. It became the language of law, administration, military command, and education throughout the empire. If you wanted to get ahead, to participate in public life, or to communicate with the imperial authorities, you learned Latin. It wasn't just imposed. It was often adopted out of necessity and ambition by conquered peoples. Think of Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia, regions that, over centuries, saw their native languages either supplanted or heavily influenced by Latin. This linguistic diffusion wasn't always a gentle process, but its effects were undeniably profound and long-lasting. Historians still argue whether the dominance of Latin was primarily a result of direct imperial imposition or a more organic adoption driven by the perceived benefits of being connected to the powerful Roman state. Was it force or opportunity? Regardless, the long-term impact of Latin on European languages is a mainstream linguistic fact. Over centuries, as the Roman Empire declined and fractured, the spoken Latin of different regions began to evolve independently, giving rise to the Romance languages we know today: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and many others. Even English, a Germanic language, is packed with Latin-derived vocabulary, a linguistic inheritance from centuries of Roman and later Norman French, which itself was a Romance language. Influence. You are living proof of Latin's enduring legacy, speaking words every day that trace their lineage back to the Forum in ancient Rome. It truly dominated, shaping not just the speech, but the very thought processes of millions. You've just witnessed Latin's dominion spreading across the Western world, but the exchange of language wasn't confined to the marching boots of Roman legions. Far to the east, another monumental network was flourishing, connecting empires and cultures across vast distances: the Silk Road. This is a mainstream historical fact. For millennia, this intricate web of trade routes, spanning from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean, facilitated not just the exchange of silk, spices, and precious metals, but also ideas, technologies, religions, and, crucially, languages. You can almost feel the dry desert wind on your face, taste the exotic spices in the air, and hear the polyglot chatter of merchants haggling over wares in dusty caravanserai. Imagine a caravan leader guiding his camels laden with silk through the scorching deserts and treacherous mountains of Central Asia. He's probably conversing with traders from various backgrounds: Sogdians, Parthians, Indians, Chinese, all speaking their own tongues. Communication, for these intrepid travelers, was not just a convenience, it was a necessity for survival and profit. This constant interaction meant that languages along the Silk Road were in a perpetual state of flux, constantly borrowing from and influencing one another. New words for exotic goods, measurement units, and even abstract concepts related to trade and travel would have jumped from one language to another like eager fleas. A quirky tidbit is how specific loanwords can act as linguistic breadcrumbs, tracing the historical paths of goods. For example, the word for sugar or candy in many European languages can be traced back through Arabic and Persian to Sanskrit, reflecting the westward movement of sugarcane cultivation and processing from India. Similarly, terms for silk, tea, and porcelain often show East Asian origins in Western languages. It's almost as if every new commodity brought its own linguistic passport, getting stamped with new pronunciations and slight semantic shifts as it traveled across continents. You can imagine a Roman merchant struggling to pronounce sick for silk, eventually just giving up and making it sound more Roman. These were not simple one-way exchanges. The Silk Road facilitated a rich tapestry of linguistic borrowing and blending. Sogdian, an East Iranian language, became a lingua franca for trade in Central Asia, deeply influencing neighboring Turkic and Chinese dialects. Buddhism, originating in India, spread along these routes, carrying its Sanskrit and Pali terminology with it, enriching the vocabularies of Tibetan, Chinese, and other East Asian languages. Later, the spread of Islam introduced Arabic loanwords and concepts across vast stretches of the route. It was a linguistic melting pot, simmering for centuries, continually adding new flavors to existing tongues. Historians still argue whether the linguistic impact of the Silk Road was primarily limited to lexical borrowing, new words, or if it also led to more significant changes in grammar and syntax among the languages in prolonged contact. Was it just a vocabulary swap meet, or were languages fundamentally reshaping each other? What's clear is that the Silk Road created an environment where linguistic innovation, adoption, and adaptation were not just possible but inevitable. As you let your mind wander through those ancient bazaars, filled with the aroma of exotic spices and the murmur of countless tongues, you realize that these routes were not just pathways for goods, but superhighways for language, constantly refreshing and redefining the spoken word for millions across vast and distant lands. You've seen how trade routes like the Silk Road created a dynamic interplay of languages, constantly borrowing and blending. But rewind your mental tape a bit, back to the dawn of civilizations, and you encounter a different, yet equally profound aspect of linguistic development: the sheer diversity of tongues emerging from distinct communities. This brings us to the echoes of Babel, not necessarily as a literal tower, but as a powerful metaphor for how diverse populations contributed to both linguistic fragmentation and, paradoxically, fusion. It's a mainstream historical fact that as human populations grew and spread, language naturally diversified into countless dialects and distinct languages, even as later interactions led to new forms of linguistic mixing. You can almost feel the primordial urge to connect with your immediate group, to establish a shared identity through unique sounds. Imagine a group of early farmers, perhaps just a few hundred strong, settling in a fertile valley. Over generations, their way of speaking, their local dialect, will naturally drift from that of a similar group settled just a few valleys over. Small pronunciation shifts, new words for local flora and fauna, slightly different grammatical constructions. These seemingly minor changes accumulate over time, much like continental drift. Without constant, heavy interaction, these dialects will eventually become mutually unintelligible languages. It's like watching two friendly streams flow from the same source. But as they diverge, they carve out their own unique paths, creating separate riverbeds. A quirky tidbit is how even subtle geographic barriers, like a mountain range or a dense forest, could historically lead to significant linguistic divergence between groups that were once, perhaps, a single speech community. The sounds of birds, the unique plants, the very landscape itself could inspire new words and idioms that would not develop in a different environment. Imagine trying to explain the subtle nuances of fog rolling over the misty moor at dawn to someone who lives in a scorching desert and has never seen such a thing. Their language would simply lack the specific vocabulary or poetic constructions for it, forcing new linguistic creations. Yet, as these distinct linguistic groups grew and inevitably encountered each other through trade, conflict, or migration, a fascinating paradox emerged. While fragmentation created distinct languages, these encounters also led to linguistic fusion. People had to find ways to communicate, leading to the development of pidgins, simplified contact languages, creoles, pidgins that become native languages, or simply massive amounts of loanwords being absorbed from one language into another. You might call it linguistic mingling, sometimes forced, sometimes voluntary. Think of it like a diverse potluck dinner. Everyone brings their own dish, but by the end, flavors are mixing and matching in unexpected, delicious ways. Historians and linguists still argue whether the primary driver of linguistic diversity was geographic isolation and genetic drift in language, or if it was more strongly influenced by social and cultural factors, such as group identity and the deliberate creation of unique dialects to distinguish one's community. Was it a natural process of divergence or a conscious act of differentiation? Regardless, the ebb and flow of linguistic fragmentation and fusion has been a constant throughout human history, a dynamic dance between distinctness and interconnectedness. You can almost hear the cacophony of ancient marketplaces, a mosaic of sounds where every word spoken, every phrase exchanged, was a testament to humanity's endless capacity for both uniqueness and adaptation in the grand linguistic symphony. You've delved into the grand tapestry of linguistic diversification and fusion, a natural consequence of human movement and interaction. Now, let's consider a more subtle, yet equally profound shift that occurred with the rise of writing, the gradual, sometimes imperceptible, decline of oral traditions as the sole repository of knowledge and history. This is a mainstream historical fact. Before widespread literacy, societies relied entirely on spoken word. Epic poems, stories, laws, and genealogies were memorized and transmitted across generations. But with the advent of written records, the importance of this oral memory began to wane. You can almost feel the weight shifting from the minds of elders to the silent permanence of clay and papyrus. Imagine a world where every piece of vital information, from the lineage of your rulers to the intricate instructions for building a complex irrigation system, had to be held in someone's head. And not just any head, but the heads of designated storytellers, bards, and griots, whose lives were dedicated to memorization and accurate recitation. These individuals were living libraries, ensuring the continuity of culture and knowledge. Their performance wasn't just entertainment. It was education, law, and history rolled into one captivating package. It required incredible mnemonic techniques, rhythm, rhyme, repetition, and vivid imagery to ensure fidelity over centuries. It's almost like everyone had to be a walking, talking audiobook of their entire cultural heritage. A quirky tidbit is the concept of a memory palace, or method of loci. Ancient mnemonic techniques that involved mentally placing pieces of information in specific locations within an imagined building. Or consider the intricate oral genealogies of many pre-literate societies, where individuals could recite their ancestry back dozens, sometimes hundreds of generations, linking them directly to founding ancestors or mythical figures. Losing your memory in such a society wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a potential societal catastrophe, akin to someone accidentally deleting the entire internet today. However, once writing arrived, the pressure on human memory began to ease. Why spend decades memorizing an epic poem when it could be written down? Why rely on the fallible memory of a witness when a legal contract could be inscribed on a tablet? Writing offered unprecedented accuracy, permanence, and reach. A written law could be disseminated consistently across an empire, ensuring everyone knew the rules. A written medical text could preserve remedies and procedures without fear of distortion through retelling. This didn't mean oral traditions vanished entirely. They continued to thrive in many forms, but their centrality as the primary means of knowledge transmission began to diminish. Historians still argue whether the decline of purely oral societies was a net gain or loss for human cognition and culture. Did the transition to literacy enhance critical thinking and analytical skills by freeing the mind from mnemonic burdens? Or did it diminish certain forms of memory and communal knowledge sharing that were central to oral cultures? Was it an intellectual upgrade or a cultural trade-off? What's clear is that the shift was transformative. As written texts became more prevalent, the very nature of what constituted knowledge began to change, moving from something embodied and performed to something external and codified. You can almost see the quiet revolution unfolding as the vibrant, fleeting sounds of spoken history slowly, irrevocably found their enduring echo in the silent, static marks of ink on papyrus or stylus on clay. You've seen the subtle shift as written records began to take precedence over pure oral tradition. This wasn't just about preserving stories. It was about establishing order, codifying behavior, and standardizing society on an unprecedented scale. This brings us to the profound impact of law codes and texts on language and social structure. It's a mainstream historical fact that as civilizations grew, written laws became indispensable tools for governance, replacing more fluid, orally transmitted customs and decrees. You can almost feel the weight of responsibility on the shoulders of ancient rulers as they sought to bring clarity and consistency to their burgeoning realms. Imagine a world where the law was simply what the local elder or chief said it was on any given day. While this might work in a small, close-knit community, it's a recipe for chaos in a city of thousands, let alone an empire. Disputes would be endless, justice inconsistent, and power arbitrary. Written law changed all of this. For the first time, legal principles could be recorded, made public, and applied uniformly. The most famous early example, and a truly monumental mainstream historical fact, is the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a tall basalt stele in Mesopotamia around 1754 BCE. This code, with its famous "an eye for an eye" principle, wasn't just a list of punishments. It was a comprehensive legal document covering everything from family law to trade regulations to agricultural practices. The very act of writing down laws demanded a new level of precision and clarity from language. Ambiguity in spoken law could be smoothed over with immediate clarification or context. But a written law, intended to be read by many and applied consistently, needed to be as unambiguous as possible. This led to the development of specialized legal vocabulary, precise definitions, and standardized phrasing. Suddenly, words like contract, witness, debt, property, and justice took on concrete fixed meanings that transcended local dialects. It's like switching from a casual chat about rules to drafting a legally binding document. Every word matters, every comma counts. You can almost picture the exasperated scribe trying to word a clause so precisely that no one could possibly misinterpret it, a challenge that still plagues legal drafters today, funnily enough. A quirky tidbit about ancient law codes is how often they included detailed tariffs or lists of fees for services, indicating a highly regulated economy. The Code of Hammurabi, for instance, specifies payment for various medical procedures, the wages for different laborers, and even penalties for a builder whose house collapses. It's like an ancient version of a collective bargaining agreement crossed with a phone book. This level of granular detail reflects the administrative capabilities enabled by written language, allowing for economic standardization and control across a kingdom. Historians still argue whether the formal codification of laws led to a more just society by reducing arbitrary power, or if it primarily served to entrench existing social hierarchies and inequalities by making them explicitly legal. Was it a step towards fairness, or a tool of oppression? Regardless, the impact on language was clear. Written law demanded and fostered linguistic standardization. It provided a powerful impetus for consistent vocabulary and grammar, creating a common legal language that transcended regional speech patterns. This formalization of language through legal texts became a cornerstone of state power, allowing rulers to govern vast territories with a degree of uniformity previously unimaginable. The silent, solemn declarations on a stone stele or a papyrus scroll were in essence speaking volumes about the newfound power of codified language to shape and control human behavior. You've seen how legal codes solidified language, but there was another, equally powerful force shaping ancient tongues: the profound influence of religious texts. This is a mainstream historical fact. Sacred writings, whether carved in stone, written on papyrus, or meticulously copied on scrolls, became central to the preservation, standardization, and widespread dissemination of specific dialects and linguistic forms. You can almost feel the hushed reverence of a temple, the soft glow of oil, lamps illuminating ancient scriptures, the air thick with incense and the whispers of devotion. Imagine a world where the words of your gods or the tales of creation were passed down purely by word of mouth. While this certainly happened for millennia, the potential for variation, distortion, and even deliberate alteration was immense. Every retelling could subtly shift the narrative, every new generation adding its own flavor. But once these sacred narratives, hymns, prayers, and laws were committed to writing, they gained an immutable quality. The written word became authoritative, a fixed point of reference that believers could return to, study, and disseminate with an unprecedented level of fidelity. It's like moving from a game of telephone to having a master recording. The message remains consistent, even as it travels far and wide. A quirky tidbit is how the very act of meticulously copying these religious texts, often by hand over centuries, could inadvertently lead to the development of highly formalized scribal traditions and even specific calligraphic styles. In ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead scrolls were often beautifully illustrated and written with a precision that bordered on artistic devotion. Similarly, in many traditions, the act of copying scripture became a spiritual exercise in itself, ensuring not just preservation but also veneration of the written word. Imagine someone spending their entire life perfecting a single letter, believing it would bring them closer to the divine. This standardization of language through religious texts had far-reaching effects. For example, the ancient Egyptian language, through its use in religious inscriptions and texts like the Pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead, maintained a remarkable continuity for thousands of years, even as the spoken language evolved. Similarly, the language of the Vedas in ancient India, or the Hebrew of the Torah, became highly prestigious and relatively resistant to change due to their sacred status. These texts acted as linguistic anchors, preserving older forms of the language and influencing subsequent generations to learn and use them. It created a powerful linguistic conservative force, often slowing down the natural evolution of language. Historians and linguists still argue whether the sacredness of these texts was the primary reason for their linguistic preservation, or if their complex poetic and narrative structures simply made them inherently resistant to casual alteration. Was it divine inspiration, or just really good storytelling? Regardless, the impact was profound. These holy writings not only transmitted spiritual beliefs, but also propagated specific vocabulary, grammatical structures, and stylistic conventions across vast geographic and temporal spans. They provided a common linguistic touchstone for diverse communities of believers, fostering a shared cultural and intellectual identity. You can almost feel the resonance of those ancient words, whispering through the ages, shaping the very way people thought, spoke, and understood their place in the universe. All thanks to the enduring power of the written sacred word. You've seen how law codes and religious texts help to standardize language, preserving certain forms and spreading specific vocabularies. But as societies became even more complex, and as literacy, however limited, began to spread beyond the most elite circles, a new kind of linguistic tool became necessary: the early dictionary. This is a mainstream historical fact. The first attempts to codify, categorize, and define language in a systematic way emerged in ancient civilizations, driven by the need for clarity, consistency, and the teaching of complex scripts. You can almost feel the quiet satisfaction of scholars and scribes as they tried to bring order to the glorious chaos of spoken words. Imagine being a student scribe in ancient Mesopotamia, struggling with the intricacies of cuneiform, with its multiple meanings and phonetic values. Or perhaps you're a Roman orator, wanting to ensure you use the precise Latin word to sway the Senate. How do you learn the correct usage, the subtle distinctions between synonyms, or the proper pronunciation of a foreign term you've just heard from a Silk Road merchant? Before dictionaries, it was largely through apprenticeship, rote memorization, and exposure. It was like trying to learn a complex computer program by just watching someone else use it, hoping to pick up all the commands by osmosis. The earliest forms of dictionaries weren't really dictionaries as we know them today. They were often lexical lists or glossaries. In Sumerian and Akkadian cultures, for example, scribes created extensive lists of cuneiform signs, often organized by theme, e.g., lists of gods, animals, professions, cities. They would provide the Sumerian sign and its Akkadian equivalent, acting as a kind of ancient bilingual dictionary, essential for cross-cultural communication and for learning the Sumerian language, which remained important for religious and scholarly texts long after Akkadian became the dominant spoken tongue. A quirky tidbit is that some of these early lexical lists also included pronunciations and even simple grammatical explanations, making them precursors to true language manuals. It's like finding a rough draft of Wikipedia from 40 years ago, written on clay. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, there were lists of hieroglyphs and their meanings, designed to help scribes navigate the complex system. Later, in the classical Greek and Roman worlds, scholars compiled glossaries of difficult words found in older texts or foreign languages, along with explanations. These weren't comprehensive alphabetic dictionaries, but they were crucial steps towards the systematic analysis and definition of language. They represented a recognition that language itself could be studied, codified, and taught in a more structured way. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for creating these early lexical lists was primarily pedagogical, for teaching purposes, or administrative, for standardizing terminology in government and trade. Was it about education, or just making bureaucracy easier? Regardless, the long-term impact was undeniable. These first attempts to codify language laid the groundwork for future lexicography. They implicitly acknowledged that language, while fluid and evolving, also had a structure that could be analyzed and defined. This was a crucial intellectual shift, transforming language from an ephemeral stream of sound into a tangible, definable system. You can almost see the satisfaction on a young scribe's face as they consult one of these lists, finally understanding a previously mysterious sign. The quiet diligence of these early linguists was, in its own way, shaping the very intellectual framework for how all future languages would be understood and taught. You've witnessed the scholarly attempts to rein in language with early dictionaries and lexical lists. But while scholars were busy categorizing words, the practical needs of empire and trade were fostering a different linguistic phenomenon, the formation of lingua francas. This is a mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, specific dominant languages emerged in multicultural regions to facilitate communication between people who spoke different native tongues, becoming the common language of commerce, diplomacy, and sometimes even everyday interaction. You can almost hear the babble of a busy port, where 1,000 different accents somehow coalesce into a shared understanding. Imagine you're a Roman legionary stationed in Gaul, needing to communicate with local suppliers for provisions. You speak Latin. They speak some form of Celtic. How do you bridge the gap? Or picture a merchant from Persia trying to trade spices with a Chinese counterpart along the Silk Road. Neither speaks the other's language fluently. In such scenarios, a dominant language often rises to the occasion, becoming the pragmatic choice for cross-cultural communication. It's like everyone agreeing to use a certain currency when traveling, simply because it's accepted everywhere. A classic example, and a quirky tidbit, is the actual historical lingua franca itself. This was a pidgin language that developed in the Mediterranean during the Crusades and medieval trade, primarily based on Italian, especially Venetian dialect, with significant borrowings from Arabic, Greek, Spanish, and French. It was a simplified, functional language used by traders and sailors. Imagine overhearing a conversation that's a bizarre mix of Italian nouns, Arabic greetings, and Greek verbs, all stripped down to their bare essentials. It wasn't anyone's native tongue, but it got the job done. Buy good, me sell more, perhaps, was the extent of its poetic license. The rise of lingua francas was often tied to the power and reach of empires. The spread of Akkadian in ancient Mesopotamia, initially the language of the Akkadian Empire, became a lingua franca across the Near East for centuries, even after the empire itself declined. Similarly, Aramaic, another Semitic language, achieved widespread prominence as a lingua franca across the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires. It became the language of official documents, trade, and even daily life for diverse populations from Egypt to India. Later, as we've explored, Latin filled this role across the Roman Empire, and still later, Arabic with the Islamic conquests. Historians still argue whether the adoption of a lingua franca was primarily a result of top-down imposition by a dominant political power or a more organic, bottom-up process driven by practical economic necessity among diverse populations. Was it forced or simply pragmatic? Regardless, the impact was profound. Lingua francas acted as linguistic bridges, enabling vast empires to function, trade to flourish, and ideas to spread, even among people who might otherwise have been linguistically isolated. They facilitated the movement of goods, people, and thoughts, proving that language, in its most adaptable forms, could overcome even the most formidable barriers to human connection. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from countless merchants and diplomats, finally able to communicate without needing an army of translators, all thanks to the pragmatic power of a shared, if sometimes grammatically simplified, tongue. You've seen language shaped by the demands of bureaucracy, religion, and trade, leading to standardization and the rise of lingua francas. But there's a deeper, more intrinsic function of language that runs through all these developments: its profound role in forging identity. This is a mainstream historical fact. Shared language acts as a powerful bond, creating a sense of belonging, unity, and distinction among groups of people, shaping communal and eventually national identities. You can almost feel the invisible threads of connection that weave through a community, strengthened by every shared word, every inside joke, every familiar accent. Imagine you're part of a small clan living in a vast ancient landscape. Your language isn't just a tool for communication, it's a secret code, a badge of belonging. The specific sounds you make, the unique idioms you use, the stories you tell in your particular dialect, these all differentiate you from the people over the next hill who speak a subtly different tongue. This linguistic distinctiveness helps define us versus them, fostering a sense of shared heritage and mutual understanding that outsiders simply don't possess. It's like being part of a club where everyone knows the secret handshake, except the handshake is every single word you speak. A quirky tidbit is how even very minor phonetic shifts or grammatical quirks can become powerful markers of group identity, sometimes even leading to social stratification or prejudice. Think of how accents or specific slang terms still function today, subtly signaling where someone is from or what group they belong to. In ancient societies, these subtle linguistic cues could determine who you traded with, who you married, or even whether you were considered friend or foe. It wasn't just about understanding the words. It was about understanding the history, the shared experiences, and the unspoken assumptions embedded within those words. As communities grew into city-states and then empires, this role of language and identity became even more complex and, at times, contentious. While lingua francas facilitated communication across diverse populations, they didn't erase native tongues. In fact, the very existence of a dominant lingua franca could heighten the awareness and value placed on one's original language. People might use Latin for trade or administration, but they would return to their native Gaulish or Coptic for prayer, storytelling, and intimate family life. The native language became a refuge, a symbol of cultural resilience against assimilation. Historians still argue whether the concept of a shared linguistic identity necessarily preceded or followed the formation of early ethnic or tribal groups. Did people speak similarly because they were a group? Or did they become a group because they spoke similarly? It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? Regardless, the unbreakable link between language and identity has been a constant throughout human history. From the distinct dialects of early farming communities to the enduring power of national languages in shaping modern states, our words are not just sounds. They are echoes of our ancestry, markers of our community, and the very fabric of who we perceive ourselves to be. You can almost feel the quiet hum of belonging, a deep-seated comfort in the familiar cadence of a shared tongue, grounding you to your people and your past. You've explored how language shapes identity, building invisible bonds within communities. Now, let's take a grand leap, stretching our linguistic ears back through the millennia to try and discern the faint, persistent echoes of the very earliest human languages, the legacy of ancient sounds. This is a mainstream linguistic fact. While no one can definitively reconstruct a language spoken 10,000 years ago, linguistic science, through comparative methods, can identify common roots and patterns that suggest deeper connections between seemingly disparate tongues. You can almost feel the vibrations of sounds that predate history, sounds that are, in some profound way, still present in the words you speak today. Imagine taking a word, say, mother, and tracing it back through Latin, mater, Greek meter, Sanskrit, mater, and Germanic languages. you'll find a striking similarity in the core sounds. This isn't a coincidence. This convergence points to a much older ancestral language, a proto-language from which these later languages diversified. Linguists use a rigorous process called the comparative method to identify regular sound changes and reconstruct these hypothetical ancestral forms. It's like being a linguistic detective, piecing together fragments of evidence from various crime scenes to reconstruct the original event. And let's be honest, trying to reconstruct ancient sounds without a recording device is a bit like trying to bake a cake from a recipe found in a dream. A quirky tidbit is the fascinating and sometimes controversial field of deep reconstruction, which attempts to link even more distantly related language families into vast macro families or even a single proto-world language. While many linguists remain skeptical due to the immense time depths involved and the erosion of evidence, the very idea that all human languages might ultimately trace back to a common ancestor is a profound thought. Imagine if, somewhere deep in our linguistic DNA, we all carry echoes of the very first human utterances. It's a bit like discovering that all pop music, no matter how different, is essentially just variations on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The sounds of these ancient tongues, though unrecorded, leave their traces in modern speech not just through vocabulary, but also through grammatical structures, patterns of thought, and even the subtle ways our mouths form certain sounds. Every time you use a grammatical case or a specific verb tense, you might be unconsciously echoing linguistic habits formed thousands of years ago by your distant linguistic ancestors. It's a subtle inheritance, woven into the very fabric of how you articulate your thoughts. Historians and linguists still argue vehemently about the methodologies and reliability of reconstructing languages beyond a certain time depth, generally considered to be a few thousand years. Is it a robust scientific endeavor, or more akin to speculative art? Regardless of the precise scientific consensus on these deepest reconstructions, the concept itself is powerful. It reminds us that language is not static. It is a living, breathing entity, constantly evolving, fragmenting, and merging, yet always carrying the faint, resonant echoes of its origins. You can almost feel the deep current of human speech flowing through you, connecting you not just to your immediate ancestors, but to the very dawn of human communication itself. You've traveled through millennia, from the first grunts in the wilderness to the intricate dance of ancient sounds echoing in modern words. Now, as the journey winds down, let's cast our gaze forward and consider the future of language. If history teaches us anything, it's that language is never static. It's a living, breathing entity, constantly evolving, adapting, and perhaps even merging. This is a mainstream linguistic concept. Language change is inevitable, driven by social, technological, and cultural shifts, and historical patterns can offer intriguing clues about what lies ahead. You can almost feel the gentle hum of technological advancement subtly reshaping the way we interact, and thus, the way our languages change. Imagine the pervasive influence of digital communication. Shorthand, emojis, and internet slang are constantly emerging, then rapidly becoming obsolete. These aren't just quirks, they are microevolutions happening at an unprecedented speed. Think of how quickly words like LOL or selfie entered the mainstream and became universally understood. Or how the very act of typing, rather than handwriting, has perhaps subtle influences on how we structure our thoughts and, by extension, our sentences. This rapid digital flow is like a linguistic superhighway, making communication faster, but perhaps also shallower in some contexts, or incredibly rich in others. A quirky tidbit is the concept of a text message accent. While not a literal accent, the distinct linguistic patterns, abbreviations, and informalities common in digital communication can subtly influence spoken language, particularly among younger generations. It's almost as if your thumbs are slowly, imperceptibly, teaching your tongue new habits. Or consider the rise of Globish, a simplified form of English often used for international communication by non-native speakers. Is this a precursor to a new global lingua franca, or merely a temporary tool? As interconnectedness continues to grow, fueled by global media, travel, and the internet, the phenomenon of linguistic convergence becomes even more pronounced. We're already seeing English functioning as a dominant global lingua franca, impacting vocabulary and even grammatical structures of countless other languages. But this isn't just a one-way street. English itself absorbs words and phrases from other cultures at an astonishing rate. It's a vast linguistic potluck, constantly adding new flavors from around the world. Historians and linguists still argue whether the increasing dominance of a few major languages, like English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, will ultimately lead to a significant reduction in global linguistic diversity, or if smaller languages will find new ways to persist and thrive in a digital age. Will the internet be a graveyard for dying languages, or a platform for their revival? Regardless of the specific trajectory, the patterns we've observed throughout history, the rise and fall of empires, the flow of trade, the forging of identities, and the relentless march of technological innovation, will continue to shape the languages of tomorrow. You can almost hear the whispered anticipation of countless unborn words, waiting for their moment to enter the grand, ever-evolving symphony of human communication. The story of language is never truly over. It simply finds new ways to tell itself. As the echoes of these ancient sounds and future whispers gently fade, feel yourself drift further into the quiet comfort of your space. The vastness of linguistic history, stretching back through countless generations, has brought us to this very moment, to these very words. Your mind, now rich with the stories of scribes and seafarers, pharaohs and philosophers, is ready for rest. Let the intricate dance of cuneiform wedges, the elegant flow of hieroglyphs, and the bold simplicity of early alphabets settle into the quiet corners of your imagination. Remember that every sound you make, every word you speak, carries within it the faint, magnificent echoes of this incredible human journey. Allow your thoughts to slow, your breath to deepen, and your awareness to soften. The languages of the past have spoken their piece, and the languages of tomorrow are yet to be fully formed. For now, simply be. Let the stillness embrace you, guiding you gently into a realm of peace and dreams. All the words have been spoken. Rest now.